Often known as the Brandfather on one of our colleagues and stations here in South Africa, known as Classic FM. But of course, Jeremy Sampson, chairman of Brand Finance Africa, joins us now to tell us more. Such a pleasure to have you in studio with us, sir.
Gugu, it's my first time actually physically with you in studio. It's my pleasure, my privilege, and thank you for the invitation. And the welcome outside was wonderful.
Oh, I'm happy to hear so. Hopefully that's left an impression on you, right, in terms of our brand experience and culture.
It's seamless.
Oh, fantastic.
So the customer experience, right up there.
Oh, thank you to our star producer and the team that makes it all happen. Really appreciate the feedback. And I guess, Jeremy, we've been speaking to each other for years, and every year we get to talk to you about different brand experiences, about brand results, brand outputs, and of course this important report regarding some of the top South African brands across the continent and the country. And perhaps before we do get into the numbers, because there's been interesting shifts taking place, it's important that we also remind our listeners about the importance of brands. No longer is it just, oh, well, we can advertise here, a bit of PR there, but brands truly do offer financial value to the businesses that they represent.
You're absolutely right. And this is where, since 2013. But people don't realize, the part brands play in their life. I remember a few years ago, I think it was the Sunday Times used to have a big marketing supplement, and I was asked to write an article on what the top branders were doing. And I put together a 24-hour clock and said, what brand are you using? What wakes you up? What puts you to sleep?
Perfect.
What's the first thing you do in the morning?
Sure.
And we had a good cross-section from all sorts of different sections. One guy in the electronics area said the first thing he did in the morning was check his glass to see if there was any single malt whiskey left. A certain lady said one of the first things she did in the morning was pull on her stockings. And then we realized it was getting so intimate. Because brands are so intimate. Now, today, what wakes you up? Perhaps your mobile phone, I don't know. You don't have alarm clock. But I think it's only the last couple of decades people have realized how brands are so intimate. After all, our mobile phone is with us virtually all the time. It's like an appendage. And what you were saying about the value, the top 100 brands are worth, I think I'm right in saying, 658 billion rands.
With a B.
With a B. Oh. That's a huge value. And then when we made the presentation at Gibbs on Thursday, I said, well, the private sector is creating the brands. Just about all brands are owned by the private sector, and you've been touching on this. But what have we got in the public sector? We've got Eskom. We've got Transnet draining us. And then I said, how many SOEs are there? How many state-owned enterprises are there? And most people would say 100, perhaps 200,
700
over 700.
Yeah.
And that's draining the economy.
Sure.
So this is where in your program you often touch on which of the brands are making money, and therefore they're paying taxes, they're creating jobs, they're going out there creating ambassadors, as it were. And that's why it is so important. And this is where we see around the world, sometimes governments start supporting brands. China 15, 20 years ago turned around and said, we haven't got any brands. So they went and bought an IBM brand and rebranded it Lenovo. And subsequently, they've been creating their own brands, the electric car, BYD and Chery.
Yes. And how many of them are on our roads today?
Well, exactly.
In terms of the
so this is
presence?
a government initiative to create brands, in their case, supported often by the public sector, but because they realize they will make money. And as in your earlier part of your program, you're talking about growth, you're talking about making money, you're talking about creating jobs. Well, what better than getting the private sector, and if possible, please, the public sector helping to grow brands for South Africa?
Valid point. And how do we do that, Jeremy? Because before we get to the list and the various companies that have featured and moved up, some might sit and say, hold on, so how do you actually build a formidable brand?
Well, one of the things is you've got to make the environment, should we say, less red tape.
Yes.
You've got to make it easier for young entrepreneurs to come along and create. Some people say, well, let's create entrepreneurs. Well, we have a lot of people, young people, full of energy. They can't get funding or they can't get advice, and this is one of the problems. We also have all the international groups in South Africa And those big international brands often stifle or kill off local brands. So you've got a tussle going on. You know, you've been talking about retail and Woolworths, and for a long, long time, you could only buy a Woolworths brand.
Yeah.
That has now changed. They realize they've got to put other brands, in some areas at least, to support their own brands and their private label.
Yeah, 100%. And we are seeing that. And interestingly enough, if we do go to the report, as you've mentioned, in total, the top 100 South African brands, their value has reached 688 billion rand. That's huge, bigger than the market cap of some JSE-listed companies. So that in itself is actually very telling. But I'm intrigued to look at the top three. Number one is MTN, valued at 50 billion. Number two is Vodacom, 43 billion, followed by Standard Bank at 37 billion. We'll touch on the others in just a moment. But there's three things that intrigue me about these entities. Firstly, dominated by telcos and financial services. These three companies also have a very strong presence across the African continent. And that intrigued me just to understand if there's a correlation between geographic reach and the value of a company, or its brand rather.
You're spot on. This is where if you're just in one country, you're very vulnerable if something goes wrong. After all, MTN has taken a huge hit in the last 12 months because of what's going on in Nigeria and the devaluation of the naira. If MTN was just in Nigeria, they would be in a terrible state.
True.
But they're not. They have a footprint, across Africa. They've scaled back over the last, 5 or 6 years. After all, to think that they were in Afghanistan, Yemen, Iran, Syria, countries like that, which today are, shall we say, difficult territories to be in. But no, this is where MTN, as I say, has been taken a huge knock this last year, but partly because of things out of their control. Their brand strength is still very, very strong. But I'm sure Vodacom are looking at this, and Vodacom has been very aggressive, going into Ethiopia and going right up north of Africa. And they're getting closer together. They're now down to about a gap of about 6 billion or so. And no, that's a huge change. So I'm sure the guys at Vodacom are salivating, but I'm sure the guys at MTN saying,
we still got it.
Exactly.
Exactly. What I also found so intriguing about this, as you've mentioned, the geographic reach, which many other entities on the list also do have outside of South Africa. But I'm intrigued by the sectors. And it almost seems as though, as you said, brands are very intimate. And either it's the telecommunication services that we use because we're constantly on our phones, or how it is that we use our money, or where it is that we spend our money. And typically the list is dominated by banks, financial services, retail, as well as telcos. Is this a coincidence or not?
Most emerging countries, you'll find telcos and banks. Right across the world. That's where the system sits. But as you rightly say, because Cell C's been having a very difficult time, as we know.
They don't even feature.
Exactly. But then when you come to the banks, Standard Bank is the number one South African bank, but the other banks are breathing down its neck. You can see from that list right behind them are the banking sector.
FNB and ABSA.
The fastest riser has been Capitec.
Yes.
And that's a brand only, 22 years old, whatever it is. So you can see, and this is a strength of South Africa, the banking sector. After all, any country needs a strong banking sector to help run it. And those companies that go into the rest of Africa, name a top pan-African brand, because in fact the most valuable is MTN. But we often talk about so many African brands are pretty well domestic, or just one or two countries. We have Standard Bank. Nigeria's got Access Bank, which is growing at a rate of knots as well. The Kenyans have two very strong banks, KCB and Equity Bank.
Yes, that's true. It's so interesting that you said, because it took me a minute. I think you saw me going into my mind and thinking, because immediately I was going to say multi-choice, and I had to say, but that's homegrown, based in South Africa, domiciled in South Africa. And I think what the example you're drawing is very intriguing for us to also pay attention to going forward, is that are South African brands also facing enhanced competition from their African counterparts in terms of growth?
You're making a very good point, and yes, they are. Nigeria, despite the naira, has got some incredible brands. I know we there was a feature on beer brands. And whilst Castle is still the top brand, shall I say, of South Africa and Africa, in the top 50 or so beer brands, I think Nigeria had about 11 or 12, and a lot of them I'd never heard of. But, just as we say the top global brands have got so many Chinese brands coming up, so when we talk the top African brands, there are so many other brands coming up, often of a low base, but there's stuff going on there. They're coming up.
Exactly. Before we do take a breather, because I do want us to continue with this conversation, Jeremy, we just have ads to play. I do want to get to an intriguing question that you mentioned earlier. We have seen some shifts in terms of the listing. Some companies have improved. Nedbank now in the top 10. As you mentioned, Capitec also growing incredibly fast. And even seeing the likes of Time Bank and African Bank, Boxer, who have all shifted in terms of their rankings and positionings. What fundamentally leads to the enhancement or the growth in the value of a brand?
Great question, as always. I think what it's about is energy and focus and continuing to invest. At the time of COVID, there was a huge debate of cutting costs, and often, as usual, cut the marketing. Yeah. Exactly. And you know that's static. Well, the brands that carried on investing, the brands that kept doing what they were still able to do within those restrictions, are the brands that have recovered the best and done the best. I also think that in banking, if you have a competitor and you have lots of competitors, it's a dogfight. But that makes it better for us as the consumer, as the customer, and they're having to stay on their game. If we go to retail, we know that, ShopRite, Checkers, we've been talking a bit about Woolworths, but look how Spar has had a difficult time.
Yes.
Look at how Pick and Pay has had a difficult time. And all this research, all these rankings were done at the end of last year, Q4 last year, and just in the first 2.5 months of this year, look what's been going on. And it's an absolute fight, almost to the death. Who's going to survive? But who's going to win? Hopefully us as the customer.
Definitely. That's exactly what we need, us as consumers winning at the end of the day, in terms of the pricing, the experience, and just the overall journey of really getting to be connected with a particular brand. Share your thoughts with us. If you have a particular brand that you absolutely love, we will share a link to the Brand Finance research in just a moment. And of course, as mentioned, looking at the most valuable brands that exist in South Africa, but also the strongest South African brands that also exist. And it's such an interesting mix when you look at valuable versus strongest brands, because that's a theme that we're going to discuss. It's 24 minutes after 7 o'clock. You're listening to Kaya Biz here on Kaya 959. If you've just joined us, we're having an intriguing conversation looking at the latest Brand Finance report that essentially tells us more about not only the top most valuable brands in South Africa, but the top strongest brands in South Africa. In studio, I'm joined by the legend, the Brandfather, godfather of all things branding, really, Mr. Jeremy Sampson, chairman of Brand Finance Africa. He giggles, but anyone who knows anything about marketing knows the levels and the depth of knowledge that Jeremy and his team do bring to the table. And today we've started off the conversation focusing on the most valuable brands. The top 5 there: MTN, Vodacom, Standard Bank, FNB, ABSA. So as you can tell, dominated by key players within the telecommunication space as well as banking brands. But of course, the top 10 also has a few contenders there and other banks that are present, including retailers. And when it comes to looking at the strongest South African brands for 2025, that in itself is actually dominated by 5 retailers and 1 bank. Checkers is at number 1, followed by Clicks, then Pick and Pay, Mr. Price at number 4, and Capitec at number 5. So very telling. And I guess when we look at the strongest brands, Checkers shouldn't surprise anyone. If we just look at the number of turquoise scooters that make their way up and down our bustling roads and streets and complexes and estates, it's quite clear that they've really penetrated the market, especially from an e-commerce point of view. Help us understand more about the assessment of strong brands and what leads to them being so dominant.
Gugu, we were talking earlier about the most valuable, so that's the financial value.
Yes.
And people forget that brands are assets. They can be bought and sold. Doesn't happen very often in South Africa, but overseas, I think Gatroad has been bought and sold, I don't know, the energy drink so many times. But sometimes companies will say, this particular brand doesn't fit are offering at the moment, or we're moving from one sector into another, or we're not making money, or we can't register it globally, or whatever. So there are sometimes various reasons, which comes back to what you were saying earlier. How do you grow a brand? You've got to invest.
Yeah.
But brand strength is about really the non-financial side. It's about perception. And I know perception's a tricky thing, because we all say perception is our own reality, and we all have different lenses we look at things through. But it's the non-financial side, it's the efficacy of all these intangibles. And that's where, as you say, the retailers are really doing very well indeed, and I think they're feeding off each other. Now, I don't know how loyal you are, whether you go to one or where you call up one particular scooter.
That's true, actually. You're right. But my loyalty perhaps is often what's tested, because when you've got options, and perhaps that's also driven by the loyalty cards, the rewards programs, but also just the efficacy and efficiency. I'm not a Woolies Dash girl, but I'm a Checkers 60/60 girl, but I don't mind going into a Woolies when I'm at a shopping center. So that's the complexity, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it depends also perhaps on your age and your lifestyle.
Sure.
After all, if you're working long days as a professional, having a scooter off your groceries is perfect. I still like to actually go into a store and wander around and just have a look sometimes. But how is Checkers doing versus Woolworths? And, depending on your driving and your route, there'll be certain shops that you'll go in and others you don't go near because they're not in your area, as it were.
Fair enough.
So community is sometimes an important thing. Where you live or where you work, do you go to shops near where you are that are convenient for you? But this is where Checkers has turned the whole thing upside down with their scooters. I live in the Ilovo area, so not far away from here. Suddenly now we can click our fingers or make a call and things arrive.
100%. This clearly tells us, as you said, businesses need to invest in their brands. They also need to adapt to the needs of their customer base, which is very wide, given the examples that we've used between the two of us. And I can imagine that for the executive leaders that we speak to, when it's company results or just getting a business update from them, this can be quite stressful. So what does this mean for chief marketing officers and CEOs who look at this report and then gauge, how have we performed?
Look, people say that there are too many rankings coming out, and there's a table for this and a ranking for that. So I get on my high horse and say, look, hang on, Brand Finance is from London. It's in 30-odd countries. We've been doing it over 30 years, and there are two international standards. This isn't thumb-sucking. And those two international standards, one relates to financial value and the other to brand equity, which is the brand strength side. And we're compliant with both. And that's where it's very important. But as you say, I think marketing directors, are looking all the time for the results. We obviously have a lot of clients, but we have a lot of well-known companies who say, when are your rankings coming out? Whether it's South Africa or the best banks in the world or the best hospitals in the world, we want to know because we're monitoring ourselves against your publicly published material. And we've been actually quite shocked how many companies are coming to us now and saying, when are you coming out with this, when that? Because, for instance, banking is coming out, I think, about the 20th of March. It's coming out later this year. But I can tell you that today I've actually had two of the top banks. When are you banking? We want to rate ourselves against the best. But you're quite right as well. How is its share price doing? Is the CEO performing? If we look at Pick and Pay, I've got a pick on Pick and Pay, I'm sorry. Since Sean Summers came back in, they had a pretty rough patch. I think Richard Brasher, the former Tesco guy, was a firm hand on the tiller. But then they had a very rough patch throughout it. And during that time, I think the family had to learn to let go. You need energy. You need to be agile. You need to be able to respond, as you're saying. And that's a challenge. So brand strength is a key metric. And as you can say, the retailers are doing particularly well. And the thing is, they've got to sustain it. You can't take your foot off the gas.
100%. Jeremy, I'm so intrigued because when I take a look not only at these brands that we experience, but I cannot neglect a golden thread that seems to stand true. We interview many of these executives. We interview their team members. We comment on their operations. it's on radio, on print, on digital, or seeing advertising media, you cannot neglect the influence that media does play in terms of the role, function, influence, and even experience of a brand. You started off your early days as a journalist, working for a newspaper, if I'm not mistaken, back in London. Maybe more in the graphics department, though. And
you have a fantastic memory because, yes, the Observer on Fleet Street, and I had to be a signed-up member of the National Union of Journalists. But, yes, I was on the creative side.
Yes.
But you're working alongside great journalists.
Yes.
So it rubs off on you. And this is my first 2 years of working, and you're programmed forever, aren't you?
Right, precisely. And that's the question is, how much of an influence does media play in terms of the experience of the brand? And not just the adverts that we see on TV and the advertising at the airport, because yes, that all speaks to, little quirks and nuances, but the conversations that you and I have, when we talk about these CEOs on our radio shows, the articles we read, and even the comments on social media, how critical is that?
I would say it's very, very critical because there's a certain part of the media you can still control, but there isn't too much of it, like ads. But then there is more and more that you cannot control. The digital, etc. And everyone has a voice now.
Yeah.
We're talking the main form of communication in Africa is the mobile phone, and anyone can get on there and have a handle here or a handle there. They can be anonymous, they can have as many as they like, and they can stir it up.
Yes.
And if you don't like a particular company, this is one of the challenges in South Africa, that there are so few journalists today that if one of them doesn't like you, they can cause chaos.
True.
Whereas if you're in somewhere like London, perhaps there are, 50 journalists. And if one doesn't like you, well, you can make sure that perhaps your message gets through to the others and create a bit of a balance. So there are a lot of challenges. And that applies, we haven't mentioned the brand that is South Africa. How does South Africa project itself around the world? Does it have one message? Does it have one focus? Is it just blah, blah, blah? And that's one of the challenges as well. So,
and is it inconsistent? In my mind, I'm thinking of Davos, and then a few weeks later, then there was load shedding, and now we're hearing about delays in the budget speech, and then it's just inconsistent. At one point, we sing from the same hymn sheet, and then the next few weeks there's uproar again and a lack of unity.
Can I recommend that they use you to say that again? Because focus.
Yes.
You can't be all things to all people. And that's where you start talking of soft power and those sort of areas. And that's where the brand South Africa has to be nurtured, invested in. Like any other brand, it needs leadership of someone who is a top professional. Otherwise, you're out there with the white sharks and you won't make it.
How critical is this? Oh gosh, Jeremy, now you've gotten me excited because we can't ignore the US influence, right? How critical is that now at a time where South Africa has faced a lot of pressure from the Rwandan president, the DRC, lots of questions around our involvement there, looking at Trump, his position in terms of trying to impose tariffs, but also saying South Africa's in crisis. They're taking the farms from the white South Africans. And then coupled with that, we at the presidency of the G20. So to me, it sounds like a quagmire, but how critical is it now more than ever that we actually manage, invest, and continue to mold and shape our messaging to the global stage?
It's got much more critical over the last 10, 15 years as digital has emerged and everyone has the power to say what they think. As you say with G20, when we all live around here, not half a kilometre from here, there's an intersection which had been, let's say, neglected.
Yes.
Well, there were 12 gentlemen tarting it up last week, and you probably know exactly where I'm talking about, where they were painting, they were filling in the road, they were making sure the lights were working. Whether they'll still be working in November, that's another question. But again, further down the road, I know where a robot has been lying on its side since before Christmas.
My goodness.
And it doesn't work, and it's just sitting there. And this is where, and we've seen the president talking just the last few days about brand Johannesburg.
Yes.
So this is where branding now relates to everything, whether it's our top 100 brands, but also our country and our city and everything. And as you've said, it's a total brand experience.
Yeah. Exactly. Literally, it's a journey. And once you drop the ball in one aspect, then things can really catch up with you and fall apart. And this brings me perhaps to a closing remark that I think is so important that we do reflect on, that brands have also been made and built by individuals, at times associated with the particular brand or company and organization or service, and sometimes brands that they build within themselves. And I say this on the back of the fact that just this past weekend, I was watching a Netflix documentary on Martha Stewart. I knew Martha Stewart, but I'm even more in love with her story now when you just look at her business trajectory and how she literally grew Martha Stewart brand and Omni Media into $1 billion entity. Fair enough, there were some repercussions at the end that were felt and that she's still trying to recover from. But what's the lesson there, especially brands around individuals, but also close links with individuals, and how reputation management, PR, marketing, all plays an intricacy into how that's managed and controlled?
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned her, because one of my daughters, that's been her heroine, as it were.
Right?
And no, she has her books,
yeah, exactly.
not just cookbooks, but life books almost.
True.
And as you say, a fantastic communicator, had a difficult time, but she's kept going and she's kept that relevance.
Yeah.
But I have to say that I don't know if in the past you ever went to the Design in Darba, because I was down there probably 15 years ago when she was on stage and she hadn't been briefed properly and she didn't connect with the audience.
Oh no.
Now the audience often there is very young. They started heckling her.
Oh no.
Almost as though she hadn't been briefed properly about the audience she was talking to. Now, that was one situation, but I think all of us, let's face it, have been heckled at various times, but she's kept herself together, she's kept her mojo, and that is so important. We always say about a brand, whatever the brand is, you've got to have awareness of that brand, but you've got to stay relevant.
Oh, yeah.
And then create the desire and the consideration and the adoption and the loyalty. Sorry, I'm throwing out marketing words to you now.
Desire, consideration,
adoption, loyalty, all those things. Because after all, you don't want a one-off. You want someone to keep coming back. If you're going to your Checkers, they want you to keep going back. They don't want you going to one of the others. And this is where you've got to create that chemistry, that mental bond. Even to the point of, if I want to go out and I don't know, have a castle and I find myself drinking a Heineken, I think I shouldn't be doing this.
Right? Jeremy, this is why I could talk to you for hours on end. We always learn, we always get to develop new insights into the key thoughts and experiences that we need to be mindful of. And also, I guess, personalizing the experiences of brands, whether it's ourselves as individuals, the stations and organizations we work for, the brands and the companies that we purchase from, or even the products that we claim to love. And as you said, sometimes just question, why do you love this particular product? Maybe it's the experience of the brand, or maybe it's how it's been messaged and marketed to you. Such a pleasure speaking to you as always, Jeremy. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Gugu, it's been my pleasure and my privilege. Thank you for having me.
Thank
and
you.
Certain brands make you look good, and other brands don't make you look so good at all. So be careful the company you keep.
100%, yes. Now I'll be looking at my friendship circle slightly differently. What kind of friends and company am I keeping? You're right. Making sure that certain brands make you look good. And I think that speaks for all of us, right, within the spaces that we're actually in. Not just in your personal capacity, but just the brands you're associating with. Chish, I nearly asked you an interesting question. I'll throw this one at you off air. For such a pleasure having you as always. Jeremy Sampson, as we know, the amazing godfather of all things to do with brand. The Brandfather is what they refer to him as. And of course, amazing broadcaster, journalist extraordinaire, worked within reputation management, communications, PR, but joining us in his capacity tonight as chairman of Brand Finance Africa. It's exactly